They thought they were the ones in control. 2 officers, a single mistake, and a life taken without mercy. But the night remembers. And what waits in the dark is not forgiveness. It is truth. Sometimes the people who commit the crime are the ones wearing the badge. But even power cannot erase a shadow, because the past always finds its way back. This is not a story about justice. It is a story about guilt, memory, and the price of a single decision. Listen closely, because each heartbeat carries the echo of what they try to hide. They believed the world would forget. They believed their uniforms could protect them. But when the night calls your name, there is nowhere to run. 2 officers, 1 life taken, and a stranger who appears when the rain falls. Some meetings are destiny, and some are judgment. Everyone has a past, but not everyone's past waits for them in silence. Tonight, something they buried is coming back. If you have ever thought that mistakes fade with time, remember their story. Because some mistakes breathe, some mistakes walk, and some mistakes return. Emotional plus suspense. This is a story of regret, so heavy it bends the soul. A story of eyes that refuse to forget, and a night that refuses to end. The rain had already soaked the cracked pavement outside the small roadside tea stall when officers Darrel and Mikel stepped out of their patrol car. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, as though the darkness was holding its breath. They were both tired, agitated, and looking for something to break the monotony of their shift, something to feel powerful over. At the corner table sat a man alone. His clothes were worn, but not dirty. His posture was calm, too calm for the late hour and the heavy atmosphere. He did not look up as the officers approached. Darrel smirked and nudged Mikel with his elbow. "Another drifter," he muttered, loud enough for the stranger to hear. Mikel stepped forward, his boots splashing the puddles, and slammed his hand on the table. The metal cup rattled against the wood, but the man did not flinch. His eyes rose slowly, deep, dark, unblinking. A gaze that did not plead, did not fear, and did not challenge. It simply observed, as if measuring their souls without a spoken word. "Identification," Darrel demanded. His voice carried a familiar tone, the one men in uniform sometimes used when they forgot that authority did not equal virtue. But the man did not reach for a wallet. He simply exhaled, a slow breath that seemed to stretch the space between them. The stall owner watched from a few steps away. His hands trembled slightly as he wiped the same glass for the 5th time. He recognized the stranger. Everyone in the surrounding villages knew the name, whispered over fires and late-night conversations, though few had ever seen him. Mikel grew impatient. He grabbed the stranger by the collar and yanked him to his feet. The movement was swift, violent, and filled with the kind of arrogance born from authority without conscience. But something about the stranger's expression shifted the moment the contact was made. There was no anger, no fear, only a deep, chilling disappointment, as if the stranger was witnessing a familiar tragedy unfold yet again. "You should let go," the stall owner whispered under his breath, but too quietly for the officers to hear. The man spoke at last. His voice was calm, steady, and carried a soft resonance that seemed to echo in the humid night air. "You do not know what you are doing," he said. The words were not a threat. They were a fact, delivered with the finality of a closed gate. Mikel laughed under his breath, his grip tightening. But Darrel froze. Something in that voice reached him. Something ancient. Something dangerous. The stranger lifted his hand slowly and placed it on Mikel's wrist. Not gripping, not forcing, simply resting. And in that moment, Mikel felt something he had not felt in years. A tremor of fear from somewhere deeper than instinct. Something in his bones remembered danger even when his mind did not. His fingers released the collar, without being told to. The stranger straightened his clothing gently and looked between the 2 officers. Rainwater ran down his face, but his eyes remained steady. "You too have taken many liberties with your uniforms," he said. "You speak to others as if the world belongs to you, as if consequences are distant things reserved for someone else." Darrel's throat tightened. There were no accusations in the stranger's voice, only truth, and truth, when spoken without emotion, cut deeper than any threat. The street remained silent. Only the sound of rain striking the metal table filled the air. "Tell me," the stranger continued, "how far do you believe your power reaches?" Darrell did not have an answer. Mikel stepped back, his confidence fractured. The stall owner's eyes widened as another figure appeared at the far end of the street. Then another, and another. Quiet footsteps. No voices. No hurry. People emerging from the darkness, as though they had always been there, waiting. The officers looked around, their earlier arrogance dissolving into something colder. Uncertainty. Recognition that they had stepped into a story already in motion. And the stranger stood between them and the gathering silhouettes. Still calm, still steady, his presence unmistakable. The kind of presence that did not need introduction. The kind that leaders feared and communities protected. The night no longer felt empty. The rain no longer felt gentle. Something was about to change for officers Darrell and Mikel. Something irreversible. And the stranger's eyes held the weight of everything that was coming next. The story remains open. The consequences have only just begun. The street seemed to narrow as the figures approached. Not because the road changed, but because the officers' world suddenly felt smaller, tighter, like the air itself was folding around them. The stranger did not move. He simply stood with one hand resting lightly on the table, as if finishing a late-night tea. His composure held an unsettling grace, the kind reserved for people who never needed to raise their voice to be heard. Darrell's pulse hammered at his temples. He tried to straighten his shoulders, to remember the training, the manual, the protocols. Yet none of those taught him how to stand before a man whose presence felt heavier than any law he had ever enforced. Mikel took a step back, then another, but the stranger spoke, stopping him. "Running does not rewrite what you've done." The words landed like weight on his spine. Not loud, not sharp, but final. They pressed into memory more than sound. The figures came closer now. Their faces were illuminated one by the flickering streetlight. They were not armed. They were not shouting. They simply arrived, as if summoned by something more ancient than authority. Villagers, travelers, workers, men who had lived quiet lives. And every single one of them kept a respectful distance from the stranger, never crossing the invisible circle around him. The stall owner finally put the glass down, his hand steady now. He stepped forward, closer to the officers, his eyes no longer trembling. "You thought he was just another wanderer," he said quietly. "And that is where your mistake began." Mikel swallowed hard. "Who is he?" His voice cracked slightly, despite his effort to steady it. The stall owner shook his head. "It is not who he is that matters." His gaze lifted to the stranger. "It is what has been done to him, and what he has done in return." The stranger turned his head slightly, acknowledging the words without confirming them. Darrell felt sweat forming beneath his collar. Despite the cool rain, every instinct told him that the world he knew had shifted. The laws he believed protected him felt suddenly paper-thin. "You have used your badges to bend others," the stranger said, his tone calm as ever. "And perhaps you believed that this town was small, silent, and forgettable." Darrell stared at him, unable to respond. "That silence," the stranger continued, "was not fear." His eyes locked directly onto Darrell's. It was patience. Mikel exhaled, the realization sinking like a stone dragged to the bottom of a river. They had not arrived in a place where people were weak. They had arrived in a place where people were simply waiting. The crowd did not close in. They simply watched, as if the next movement in this moment did not belong to them, but to the stranger alone. The stranger lifted his hand and gestured toward the empty chair across from him, a calm invitation, not forceful, not aggressive, an invitation that felt heavier than a command. Darrell did not want to sit. Every part of his mind screamed against it, but his body moved anyway, as though the decision had already been made the moment he approached the stall earlier that night. He sat. The rain tapped against the table. Mikel remained standing, unsure where he belonged now. The stranger poured tea into a second cup. The steam curled upward, fragile and temporary. "Power is not taken," he said softly. "It is given." Darrell's hands tightened around his knees. He remembered every raised voice, every shove, Every person who lowered their eyes because he wore a uniform. And what is given, the stranger continued, can be reclaimed. The crowd remained silent. The night held still. The rain softened, as if listening. Mikel approached slowly and took the seat beside Darrel. His heart beat loud in his ears. The stranger finally sat as well, across from them, level, eye to eye. There will be no anger tonight, he said. No shouting, no struggle, no punishment delivered in haste. His fingers brushed lightly against the edge of the teacup. What happens next, he said, will depend on your answers. Mikel opened his mouth to speak, but at that exact moment, a distant sound broke the quiet. A car engine, rolling slowly toward them. Its headlights cut through the rain. The crowd parted silently, making way, not resisting, not questioning. Someone else was arriving, someone who was expected, someone whose presence shifted the atmosphere once more. Darrel's pulse quickened, his breath shortened. The stranger's eyes did not leave theirs. "Stay seated," he said. His voice remained calm, unmoving. The car door opened. A figure stepped out, slow, deliberate, carrying a weight that was not physical. The officers turned toward the sound, but the stranger's voice stopped them again, soft yet unyielding. "Do not look away." The crowd watched. The rain paused on the edge of thunder. The air held the tension of something about to reveal itself. The moment stretched, waiting for the next breath to decide everything. But that breath and what followed it did not come. Not yet. The figure approached with slow, steady steps, boots pressing into wet earth, leaving deep impressions that filled with rainwater as soon as they lifted. The headlights behind him created a silhouette more than a face, a shape that carried authority, but a different kind, not official, not forced, a presence taken, earned, and remembered. Darrel felt his throat tighten, but he kept his gaze forward as the stranger instructed. The sound of each step seemed louder than the rain, measured, controlled, like a person who never rushed because the world waited for him, not the other way around. The crowd remained still, parting respectfully. Every face showed recognition. Even the stall owner lowered his gaze, not out of fear, but out of a solemn acknowledgement that something old was unfolding. The figure stopped just behind the stranger's shoulder. Only then did Darrel sense the faint shift in the air. A quiet understanding passed between the two men, though no words had been exchanged. It felt like a conversation made of history rather than sound. Mikel finally dared to lift his eyes. He saw the figure's hands. Strong hands, marked with time and labor, not softness. Hands of someone who had lived both hardship and discipline. The stranger spoke without turning his head. "You arrived sooner than expected." The figure responded with a single quiet exhale. Not approval, not disapproval. Recognition. Darrel and Mikel sat frozen, their uniforms suddenly feeling too loud, too shallow, too insignificantly thin. The stranger leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture unhurried. "You asked who I am," he said softly, "but questions of identity are rarely answered with names." He studied the two officers as if seeing not just their faces, but every decision that had brought them to this moment. "What matters is the weight of one's actions," he continued, "and the shadows they cast." The figure behind him finally stepped into the faint light. He was older than the officers, but not weakened by age. His gaze had the steadiness of someone who had stood at many crossroads and never once trembled. His eyes moved over Darrel and Mikel, not with hostility, but with a depth that forced them to confront themselves. The stranger spoke again, his voice lower now. "There are men who harm because they do not know better, and there are men who harm because they believe no one will ever stop them." He let the words hang in the rain-heavy air. "You fall between these two." Darrel swallowed hard. He felt exposed, dissected, seen in a way no courtroom or report had ever made him feel. The older figure placed a hand on the back of the stranger's chair. Still silent, but the touch held meaning. A reminder, a grounding. The stranger's voice softened further. "Tonight is not about punishment. It is about understanding." Michael's fingers trembled against the table's edge. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, to explain. But no explanation seemed large enough to fill the space between what they were and what they pretended to be. The older figure finally spoke. His voice was deep, steady, and carried none of the sharpness of judgment. "There are lines a uniform does not allow you to cross," he said. "But you cross them as though they did not exist." He stepped to the side, allowing the rain light to reveal his face fully. And in that moment, the officers understood. He had once worn a uniform, too, but his was marked by things the academy never taught. The stranger stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not move quickly. "Stand," he said to the officers. Not a command, an inevitability. They rose, slow, reluctant, aware. The crowd watched, silent, patient, as if everyone already knew what came next, except the two men who now stood trembling. The stranger stepped forward, closing the remaining space between them, so close that the officers could see the rain droplets resting on his eyelashes. "What happens now," he said, "will not be decided by me." Darrel felt a cold weight settle in his chest. Mikel's breath caught. The stranger stepped aside, revealing someone standing behind him that neither officer had noticed until now. A presence they recognized instantly. Someone connected to a moment they both had hoped was forgotten. Someone whose eyes held a memory of what they once did and never accounted for. The officers felt their hearts sink, slowly and completely. The crowd leaned in slightly. The rain softened, almost silent now. The air waited. The person took one single step forward, their expression unreadable, their silence louder than any accusation. The next words were about to be spoken, words that would decide everything. They were right there, on the edge of breath, almost spoken, but the night held its silence, and the moment remained suspended, unresolved, waiting. The person who stepped forward wore no expression of anger, yet their presence struck harder than any raised voice could have. A woman, mid-30s perhaps, though grief had carved deeper years into her face. Her clothing was simple, her posture still, her eyes fixed on the two officers with steadiness that made Darrel and Mikel feel as though they were standing in front of a mirror that finally showed them the truth of themselves. Mikel's jaw tightened. His memory did not fail him. He remembered her, a roadside argument that should have stayed words, a husband who raised his voice but never raised his hand, a misunderstanding escalated by ego and uniform, one swing of a baton too quick, a life ended in the mud. It had been written in the report as self-defense. The department had closed the case within a week. Mikel had told himself it was justified. Darrel had told him it would fade. But now that memory stood before them in the rain, breathing. The woman stopped only a few steps away. Her eyes did not waver. There was no hatred in them, which made the moment infinitely heavier. The stranger and the older figure remained silent. The crowd did not shift. The rain felt like it slowed, each drop taking its time to fall. Darrel opened his mouth, but no words came out. There was nothing to defend, no sentence that could make the world rearrange itself back to before. The woman spoke, and her voice was soft, not gentle, not unbroken, just soft, like someone speaking to a memory instead of the living. "You remember him," she said. Mikel's breath caught. There was no point pretending. "Yes," he whispered, though the word nearly failed on his tongue. The woman nodded once, not in approval, not in forgiveness, simply acknowledging the truth spoken aloud. The older figure stepped to her side, but did not touch her. He was there, so she did not stand alone. The stranger's gaze moved between all three of them. He did not interfere. He did not direct. He let the moment shape itself. "You took everything from me," the woman said, not with accusation, but like someone reading from a ledger that had already been balanced. "You took my home, my safety, my future." Mikel closed his eyes, and rain moved down his face like something close to regret, but not fully reaching it. Darrel stared at her hands. They did not shake. He realized this was not the first time she had stood before those who wronged her. It was simply the first time the world was quiet enough for her voice to carry. The woman inhaled slowly. Her voice remained steady. "What I want is not revenge." The crowd shifted, barely, not with disappointment, but with attention, listening. waiting. What I want, she continued, is for you to understand the weight of what you made of your own hands. She lifted her gaze fully to meet Mikel's. You believed your power protected you, but power is only borrowed, and everything borrowed must one day be returned. Mikel's legs weakened, and he gripped the chair to stay upright. Darrel's breathing grew shallow. He felt the world tilt, but the ground held him in place. There was nowhere to step, nowhere to break away from this moment. The stranger finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the night with clarity. The past has a way of arriving on its own schedule. No lock, no badge, no title can stop it. He turned his head slightly toward the woman. You have the final word tonight. The crowd seemed to hold a collective breath. The officers stood at the edge of something that had no name. The woman looked at them. Her eyes did not harden. They softened instead, in a way that was far more devastating. Look at me, she said. And they did, because there was no force in the world strong enough to look away. She spoke again, slow, clear. You will learn what it feels like to live with the weight of memory, not by command, not by punishment, but by being seen. She stepped backward once, then twice, not retreating, releasing. The air shifted. The moment did not break. It deepened. The stranger looked at the officers once more, his expression unreadable but not empty. We are not finished, he said. The words were simple, not a threat, a promise, an unfolding. The older figure turned toward the car and opened the driver's door. The woman walked with him, the crowd parting in silence as she passed. The door closed. The engine started. The car began to roll away, its headlights fading into the wet dark. But the officers remained where they stood, rooted, breathing the same night air, yet somehow standing in a different world. The stranger turned, walked past them, toward the deeper shadows of the street, where the rain thickened and the night swallowed shape and sound. The crowd followed behind him, step by careful step, like a tide returning to shore, until only Darrel and Mikel remained at the empty table. The teacups still steamed. The rain still fell. Their uniforms still clung to their skin. But nothing felt the same. And then, from somewhere far down that silent, darkened road, came the faint sound of footsteps returning. Slow, purposeful, drawing closer. Not rushed, not hesitant. Someone was coming back. But the moment of who it was and why remained just beyond the edge of the officer's breath. Suspended, unresolved, waiting. The footsteps did not hurry. They drew nearer with a patience that made the silence feel alive. Darrel and Mikel stood motionless, as if any sudden movement would break something holding itself together by a single thread. The rain had slowed to a thin mist, drifting through the air more than falling. Streetlights flickered in quiet intervals, casting long shadows across the wet ground. Every detail felt sharpened, as though the world wanted them to remember this night forever. At last, the silhouette emerged beneath the weak glow of the nearest lamp. It was a young boy, no older than 15, thin frame, soaked through by the rain, but his steps held a certainty far beyond his years. He stopped a few feet away from the officers. He did not speak. He simply looked at them. His eyes carried the same calm depth the stranger had, not fierce, not frightened, just aware, as if he already understood the shape of things adults struggled to name. Mikel recognized him first, not by face, but by resemblance. The eyes, the jawline. The boy was the son of the man from that night, the night that had never left Mikel's memory, no matter how tightly he tried to seal it. His breath felt sharp in his chest. Darrel shifted his weight, but the boy's gaze did not move. He looked at them both equally, with a stillness that felt like judgment without words. The boy's voice, when it finally came, was steady. My mother did not come here to punish you. The officer said nothing. She came to return a memory that does not belong to her anymore. He lifted his hand to his chest, pressing 2 fingers just above his heart. She gave it to me. There was no anger in the gesture, no bitterness, just inheritance, passed like a name, a story, a scar. Darrel's hands trembled at his sides, though he tried to hold them still. He looked at the boy and saw something he did not know how to fight. Not hatred, but something more unbreakable. Memory that walks, breathes, grows. The boy stepped closer. The rain tapped softly against the metal roof of the tea stall. "You took one man," he said, "but you created many." His words did not rise in volume. They did not need to, and every one of them knows your names. Mikel felt the weight of air press against him, a pressure that came not from threat, but from consequence finally given form. The boy looked at Darrel, then at Mikel, and then at the empty chair where the stranger had sat. His voice softened. "He is not here to decide what becomes of you. He does not need to be." Darrel opened his mouth, maybe to apologize, to explain, to plead. But the boy raised his hand slightly, and the words dissolved before they reached sound. "This is not a night for speaking," the boy said. "This is a night for remembering." He took one step back, then another. The officers watched him, unable to move. The boy turned slowly and began walking toward the far end of the street, the direction the stranger had taken earlier. His steps were quiet, certain, unhurried, like someone who knew exactly where he belonged and where they no longer did. As he walked away, the street seemed to grow wider again. The world breathed. The rain picked up. Life resumed. But something had been marked, set, shifted in a way that could not be undone. Mikel finally sat down. His legs could no longer hold him. Darrel remained standing, but his posture had collapsed inward, like a building that still stands but has already fallen inside itself. The tea had gone cold. The night had grown quieter. Only the sound of the boy's footsteps lingered in memory. And then, just when the silence felt complete, a deep rumble of thunder rolled across the horizon. Slow, heavy, drawn out. The kind of thunder that announces something is coming. Not storm, not rain, something else. The officers lifted their heads, listening, waiting. But no lightning came. No rain intensified. Just that single sound, a promise in the distance. Low, unfinished, unanswered. And somewhere in that darkness beyond the road, beyond the trees, beyond the edges of the known night, someone else began to approach. Not fast, not slow, just coming, closer and closer and closer. But the rain, the dark, and the waiting held everything just out of reach. The thunder faded, but the silence it left behind settled differently this time. Not empty, not relieved, but expectant, as if the night itself was listening. Darrel stood in the rain, his uniform heavy against his skin. Mikel sat slumped in the chair, his breath slow, shallow, unsure. Neither of them dared speak. Words felt too fragile now, too loud, too unsteady to be trusted. The sound of the coming steps continued, still distant, but growing clearer, steady, measured, confident, not hurried, yet purposeful in every pace. The path beyond the tea stall was a long road of cracked concrete and quiet shadows. Dense trees lined either side, their branches dripping rainfall in slow, rhythmic taps. The footsteps emerged from that darkness. Someone walking the road as if they belonged to it. The stall owner had not moved since the others left. He simply watched the road, shoulders straight, hands resting on the counter. He was not afraid. He had expected this part too. Mikel lifted his head slightly. "Who is coming?" he asked, but his voice barely rose above the rain. It was not a question to anyone in particular, just a hope that someone would answer. No one did. The steps grew louder. Slow, deliberate crunching of gravel under steady weight. Darrel felt the air shift again, the same way it had when the stranger first stood from his seat. Whoever was approaching did not appear quickly. Their silhouette formed slowly, piece by piece, as they passed beneath each flickering streetlight. First the outline of a coat, then broad shoulders, the shape of a head held high. Finally, the person stepped fully into the light. It was a man, not tall, not imposing, not theatrically intimidating. His presence was quieter than the stranger's, but no less significant. Quiet in the way deep rivers are quiet, still at the surface, but carrying depth beneath. His face was calm, eyes steady, hands empty. No weapon, no visible authority. no uniform like theirs. Yet he walked as though the ground itself knew him. He looked at Darrel first, not searching for guilt, not looking for fear, simply seeing him completely. Then his gaze shifted to Mikel, who forced himself to stand. Even if his legs trembled, he refused to remain seated for this man, though he did not know why. The man stopped a few feet away. Rain gathered on his coat, sliding in quiet trails to the pavement. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but carried a depth that made both officers listen without resistance. "You saw the boy," he said, "and you felt the truth of him." Neither officer responded. They did not need to. The man continued. "What you did was not forgotten. Not by his mother. Not by this town. Not by the man who stood here before you." His words did not accuse. They reminded. There are places in this world where justice wears a badge. He paused. There are places where it does not. Darrel lowered his gaze. A drop of rain fell from his chin to the ground. He heard it hit the earth like a final punctuation. The man stepped closer. Not aggressive, not forceful, just near enough that the officers could see the clarity in his eyes. "You believe the world was shaped by your authority," he said. "But authority ends where consequence begins." The silence between them deepened. Heavy, but not suffocating. More like a teacher waiting for a student to realize the answer on their own. Mikel swallowed. His voice came out low, cracked from carrying too much weight for too long. "What happens to us now?" The man did not answer immediately. His expression did not shift. He simply breathed in the night air, as if measuring its depth. Then, quietly, "That depends on how you choose to carry what you now know." He turned his head slightly, looking toward the empty road where the boy had disappeared. "You cannot return what was taken," he said, "but you can decide what you become from this point forward." Darrel exhaled, a breath he did not realize he had been holding. And for the first time in years, the weight of his uniform felt heavier than the badge it carried. The man stepped back. Only one step, but the space it created felt vast. Mikel looked up at him, waiting for judgment, for punishment, for instruction. But the man only lifted his eyes toward the dark road. "The night is not finished," he said, and the way he said it made both officers feel as though the story was nowhere near its end. That something else still moved in the darkness, something unseen, something inevitable. The man turned and began to walk the same direction the stranger had taken, his step steady, unhurried. The stall owner exhaled softly, as if releasing a thought he had held for too long. Darrel and Mikel stood alone again, not as officers, not as men of power, but as men who had been seen. The rain returned to a slow drizzle. The night held its breath once more, and somewhere down the long, wet road, another sound began to rise. Not footsteps this time. Something else. A presence, approaching slowly, drawing closer, not revealing itself yet. The moment stretched, just enough to keep the heart waiting, just enough to keep the night listening, just enough that nothing could end here. Not yet. The new sound rose slowly, almost hidden beneath the rain. Not footsteps on gravel this time. Softer. A faint drag of something along the wet road, like fabric soaked through, pulled forward one measured step at a time. Darrel and Mikel turned toward the sound without speaking. Their bodies no longer obeyed the pride or authority they once wore like armor. They stood exposed, listening with the raw attention of men who understood that the night was no longer theirs to command. The stall owner remained behind them, his presence steady. He did not step forward. He did not need to. He had seen enough nights like this to know that some moments are meant to unfold without interference. The sound grew clearer. A slow shuffle, a quiet breath, a presence approaching without haste. Not threatening, not hiding, just moving through the darkness as though it had every right to. The street lights flickered again. The road shimmered with reflections of amber and shadow. The rain lifted into a thin mist, drifting sideways with the wind. At last, a figure came into view. An old man. His steps were uneven but deliberate, each one placed with intention. His clothes were simple, layered against the cold, but worn at the edges like someone who had worked with his hands his entire life. His shoulders were narrow, but his posture held a dignity that age had not eroded. His face did not carry sorrow, nor anger, nor judgment. It carried knowledge, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that simply arrives. He stopped just a few paces from the officers. The air stilled around him, as if even the rain slowed to listen. When he spoke, his voice was soft, but every word settled into the night with the weight of something that did not require force to be believed. "You too think this ends tonight," he said. His tone was neither cold nor warm, merely true. "You think your regret is something you can feel for a moment and then walk away from." Mikel lowered his eyes. Darrel felt his pulse in his throat. The old man continued, "Regret is not a doorway you pass through. It is a room you live in, day after day, year after year." His gaze moved from one man to the other, slow and steady. "And some rooms have no windows." The words did not echo. They did not need to. They simply remained, hanging in the air between them. The old man stepped forward, not close, not imposing, just enough that the officers could see the clarity in his eyes. "You took a life," he said, "and a life is not a thing that disappears when you look away." Michael's breath trembled. Something unspoken and heavy shifted inside him, a realization that was not new, but had been waiting for acknowledgement. Darrel swallowed hard. His voice, when he finally spoke, came out quiet. "What do you want us to do?" The old man did not answer at first. He simply looked at them, long enough that the silence shaped the meaning by itself. Then, softly, "It is not about what you do. It is about who you become." He turned slightly, as if preparing to leave, but he paused, and the pause felt like the night, leaning closer to hear what came next. "There is someone," he said. His tone changed, not darker, but deeper, more rooted. The officers felt their chests tighten, instinctively, as if they already knew the truth of this before it was spoken. "He has been waiting longer than any of us," the old man said, "and he has not forgotten." The rain thickened again, pattering against metal and stone. The air grew heavier. The road behind the old man seemed darker now, as though holding something unseen, something approaching, something patient. Darrel felt the hair on his arms rise. Michael's fingertips curled into fists, though he did not know whether he wanted to defend himself or pray. The old man began to walk away, his steps slow, his figure fading back into the darkness from which he came. He did not look back. The stall owner closed his eyes, just once, as if acknowledging the shift that had now taken hold. And the night once again held a waiting silence. No voices, no crowd, no instructions, just the weight of something drawing nearer, slowly, steadily, without haste. Whatever was coming did not need to rush. It knew exactly where they were, and that they could not leave. The road remained empty for now, but the presence, the one the old man spoke of, was already near enough to be felt. Close, getting closer, close enough that the air itself seemed to watch, and the moment stretched, held at the edge of revelation, suspended, unfinished, waiting. A quiet stillness settled over the road, as if the night itself was holding its breath. The rain eased into a light drizzle, falling gently now, soft enough to hear the shifting of clothes, the faint stir of wind, the steady beating of hearts burdened with weight. Darrel and Mikel remained where they stood. Two men whose uniforms no longer meant protection or authority, only memory, only consequence. The figure the old man spoke of did not appear as a shadow or a threat. He stepped into the faint glow of the streetlight like someone returning home, his posture unhurried, his expression calm, his presence unmistakable. A man in plain clothes, simple, ordinary, the kind of person one would pass on the street without looking twice. Yet there was something in his eyes, something steady and quiet and full of history, not rage, not accusation, something far more difficult to face, recognition. He looked at the two officers for a long moment, not to see their faces, but to see their souls. Michael's throat tightened. His voice carried the rawness of truth when it finally came. "We cannot return what we took." The man nodded slowly. His expression did not harden, did not soften. It simply remained. "I know," he answered. The words were gentle, but they left no room for escape. Darrel tried to speak, but his voice failed him. Emotion filled the air, quiet but immense, the kind that does not cry out, but sinks deep and changes the shape of a life. The man stepped closer. The space between them held no fear, only clarity. "You cannot rewrite the past," he said, "but you can decide what kind of men you will be after this moment." His gaze moved from one to the other, slow, certain. "If you choose to bury this, it will bury you in return. If you choose to hide from responsibility, it will chase you without end. But if you choose to live differently, truly differently, then the life that was lost will not have been taken for nothing." The night seemed to breathe again. The rain washed across concrete, carrying the dust of all that had been unspoken. Mikel closed his eyes. Darrel bowed his head. Something unbroken had cracked open inside them, not from fear, not from punishment, from truth finally being allowed to exist. They did not kneel. They did not fall. They simply stood, stripped of the weight of pretending. The man gave a single quiet nod. His presence, heavy and real, felt like a closing chapter, not forced, not complete, but understood. He turned away, not in abandonment, not in forgiveness, in release. The stall owner let out a slow breath. The old man's words lingered in memory, without needing to be spoken again, and the night continued, not brighter, but no longer dark in the same way. Darrel and Mikel remained standing in the rain. Two men at the beginning of something new, not redemption, not punishment, something far more human, responsibility. The road ahead of them was long, and it would not be easy, but for the first time since that day, they took a step forward, not as officers, not as fugitives of their own past, as men who understood what their next breath meant. The rain fell softly, the world moved on, and the story reached its end, not with closure, but with a beginning.